The United States witnessed two speeches yesterday, one by President Biden from the Oval Office, from the Resolute desk, as he repeatedly reminded us, the other by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, delivered to Congress. I will say straight away that though the content of neither speech surprised me, both speeches basically, to my mind, give a good illustration of the many problems that we face today and why those problems, for the moment at least, continue to get worse. Let's start with President Biden's speech. It lasted 11 minutes. It was delivered, as I said, from the Oval Office, from the Resolute desk. I'm not quite sure why President Biden felt the need to harp on the fact, but anyway, he did. What I had been hoping that he would at least provide was an explanation of the events of the last couple of days, the events that caused him to change his mind and to decide that he was not going to seek the nomination of his party as a candidate in November's presidential election. After all, right up until Saturday, we were getting reports which appeared to originate from him and from his original team that he had every intention of standing. Well, there was no real explanation. The one comment that President Biden did make over the course of his address was that he acted in order to preserve party unity. Now, I have to say that I found that a troubling use of words. In a recent video, I discussed the somewhat Soviet style of the events of the weekend, the strange way in which President Biden announced his decision that he would not be standing as a candidate in the November's election, the equally extraordinary way in which various members of the Democratic Party appeared to unite behind Kamala Harris as the candidate. I said that it did all bring rather strongly to mind the history of the Soviet Union, especially in its later phases, the disappearance of the old leader, the appearance of the new, the effortless transfer of loyalty from the old leader to the new, and all of that. And here we have President Biden talking about the unity of the party, which again, I have to say to people of my generation and my course of studies, does again smack a little of some of the things that used to happen in the Soviet Union not so long ago. The unity of the party. Well, Soviet officials would have been very well familiar with that particular concept. In fact, in one of the power struggles that took place in the Soviet Union, the losing faction was labeled by the Soviet leadership as the anti-party group. Anyway, that was the only explanation that President Biden gave, that he wanted to preserve the unity of the party at an existential moment in the history of the United States. As to that, we will come back to in a moment. Anyway, he did not discuss his health. He did not discuss the questions about his health, the issues that have been constantly discussed and talked about in the media by members of his own party over the last few weeks. For the record, over the course of this address, well, he spoke in a sort of hoarse voice, as he has increasingly been doing in recent months. His face was largely impassive, but he managed to get through the speech without too much fluffing. The words came out clearly. He moved his hands. I thought that he looked better for example, that he did in his debate with Donald Trump. Just say. But anyway, he said nothing about that. He didn't discuss his health. He didn't discuss the reasons why his party might have been divided if he had chosen to stay. He said nothing about the complaints and concerns that had been raised about him. It might have been a good and correct thing to say, for example, that though he did not think that the concerns that people had expressed about his health and his physical and mental state were justified, that he felt perfectly capable himself of remaining president. He did understand that doubts were growing. He did acknowledge that his conduct of the recent debate was not perhaps such as to have allayed those concerns. And in light of this, he felt that the moment perhaps had come for him to move on. Well, that would have been a graceful way of explaining what had happened. But of course, he didn't do that. He just avoided the whole topic. He didn't provide any reason why he would want to step down. He provided no reason at all why he intends to stay as president, though it's quite clear that he does, in fact, intend to do so. And frankly, I don't think this is correct. I think this is not treating the American people correctly or properly. They are, after all, according to the Constitution, the sovereign power in the United States. I think that they are entitled, at least to an explanation from the president, why he is not seeking re-election in November, given that just a few days ago he indicated that he was. But, as I said, he did not provide that, nor did he provide much in the way of reassurance or explanation of why, having taken the decision to go, he insists nonetheless that until January he's going to stay. The contradictions, I suppose, in that made it too difficult even for his wordsmiths, and I think that he probably also felt that if he had discussed the concerns about his health too much, that might have brought up the issue of whether it's really appropriate for him to remain president at this time. And, well, we did get some insight into his thinking and to the kind of person, politically speaking, that Joe Biden has become. He used one phrase which, to my mind, confirms that Joe Biden, the man, has now completely assimilated the neocon beliefs. He was not one always, by the way. The Joe Biden of the 1970s and 1980s, and I remember the Joe Biden of the 1980s, was not yet the kind of hardline neocon that he has become. There were people who you could describe as holding neocon views in the 1980s, but Joe Biden at that time was not one of them. But now he has gone over to that completely, and in this I believe, in this one thing I believe, he is completely sincere. And he again used that phrase. What gave that away was his use of that phrase, which he has used before, but that phrase which is central to the neocon credo, which is that the United States is not just a nation, it is an idea. Now, I have expressed my own deep concern about this mystical view that the United States is something more than its people, than its institutions, than its systems of law, than its governance, but that it's something that exists also in the metaphysical realm of ideas. I think that is something that automatically is going to put the United States in conflict with most other countries, organized and perhaps representing what the neocons would say was a different set of ideas. And in terms of the United States itself, it constrains the United States, if this view is accepted, to act in particular ways and also not to act, not to conduct actual necessary changes and reforms which the United States itself might need in order to evolve and develop properly. After all, if the United States is an idea, then you could argue that any change to the United States is in some way or form a betrayal of that idea. And again, that, to my mind, partly explains the level of stasis, the stagnation that exists in the United States today. And it also explains partly why US foreign policies are so difficult to change, why the United States finds it so difficult to come to terms with other countries with which it is in conflict. Doing so again is going to be represented as a betrayal of the idea of the United States that the United States is supposed to be. So, I don't like that phrase. As I said, the neocons constantly use it, and President Biden did in his address. That brings us to the next part of his address, the part of his address which I personally found the most disturbing of all, because perhaps in part because this idea of the United States that the neocons have, an idea which I suspect most American people are indifferent and uninterested in, is being challenged in certain ways. Some of the economic and foreign policy arrangements of the United States are indeed under some sort of challenge. Well, President Biden depicted the United States of today as being surrounded by enemies on all sides. Enemies outside, China and Russia, enemies within, and though he didn't define or identify his enemies, it was absolutely obvious whom he was talking about, and he was talking about his adversary in the election and the political movement which that adversary represents. And according to President Biden, all of these various forces, the ones outside and the ones within, all apparently have the same purpose and the same objective, which is to destroy democracy. Democracy being, of course, that which the neocons are supposed to embody and represent. And as I said, Biden himself is nowadays clearly one. It was most interesting, again, how Biden, the president, didn't really go into any of the detail of what he exactly means when he talks about democracy. He didn't really talk about institutions in any meaningful way. He didn't talk about the American people, in my opinion, in any very meaningful way either. He gave a long list of his various achievements, some of which one could challenge, but he didn't address, for example, or acknowledge any of the concerns, the many concerns that millions of Americans have about as they go about their everyday lives. Those didn't really seem to concern or interest him very much. But he did talk about the enemies all around, especially, I have to say, the enemies within. And again, as a result, he raised the whole issue of the election in November to almost existential heights. And it was striking, again to me, that he talked about political violence being unacceptable, but he didn't, of course, mention the one act of political violence, the most extreme act of political violence that has taken place in recent weeks, which is, of course, the attempted assassination of his opponent, which came, well, just a millimetre, or perhaps less, close to success. That really didn't register with the president at all. And I have to say, I think this kind of apocalyptic language and imagery is extremely concerning. It is deeply polarizing. It is very incendiary. Immediately after the assassination attempt, we were hearing statements and comments about how the president himself and other people on his side would attempt to moderate their language, not to give or appear to give any kind of support to the actions that were made, the attempted assassination that took place of Donald Trump. But sure enough, in his address to the American people, it seemed to me that the president was back at that all over again. Well, a bleak and heavy picture as the president departs the scene. He was supposed to be a stabilizing, unifying force. This was how his presidency was represented when he became president in 2021. But it seems to me that his actions, on the contrary, have sowed and intensified divisions, even as they have placed the United States in what seem to be confrontations with the other great powers, for which the president, of course, and his team seem to have no answers. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this address. A very worrying one, but at least we can hope that at some point over the next 6 months, he really will be going. Now, the other address, Prime Minister Netanyahu in Congress, was, from a rhetorical point of view, vastly more skillful. Joe Biden, as I well remember, was quite an accomplished orator in his heyday in the 1980s and 1990s, but he was never an orator of the standard that Prime Minister Netanyahu is. And Netanyahu came to Congress and delivered exactly the kind of fiery, defiant, immensely manipulative speech which one would expect of him. He played most of Congress like a violin. He said all the things that they wanted to hear. He was, again, extremely skillful at conjuring up, once again, all the old tunes from the 1930s and 1940s, the Churchillian rhetoric, in fact, the references to Churchill and to Roosevelt, the, I thought, astonishing comparison of 7th of December 1941 with 7th of October 2023, which it seemed to me Americans might actually recoil towards. But anyway, Netanyahu made it. He also, for the first time that I think he has done, he actually attacked certain groups of Americans. He said some extraordinary things about the protesters. He completely misrepresented their intentions, smearing them in the most crude way. And he made an astonishing claim that many of them were being funded by Iran, an allegation for which he provided no evidence whatsoever, and which, well, for all I know, one or two people might have received money from Iran. I can't definitely say that isn't the case, but certainly it is not true of the vast majority of them. It's strange to me that Netanyahu can come to Congress, as I said, say things like that about a section of American society, and it goes virtually unchallenged in the media and elsewhere. But anyway, put all that aside, it was a very skillful, very clever speech, one which will undoubtedly have shored up his support and the support for his policies in Congress. But for me, it could not conceal the ultimate hollowness behind the entire speech, because Netanyahu came to Congress with no ideas at all of how to lead Israel, and by the way, the United States, out of the terrible predicament in which they find themselves. I said that he was talking again, using again Churchillian rhetoric. He was talking about give me the tools and give us the tools and we will do the job. A phrase attributed to Winston Churchill when he was pressing the United States to enact Lend-Lease. So, we had all of that again. We had the talk about Hamas and the tremendous evil that Hamas represented. All of that was there. But there was no clear explanation of any kind of strategy, any kind of political strategy for Israel going forward. No plan other than to go on doing that which Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu have been doing ever since 7th October, which is to launch unending attacks on Hamas in Gaza, turning Hamas into a completely destroyed place, a humanitarian disaster, for which, by the way, he appeared to blame Hamas. But anyway, all of that, and hint always about larger wars and new NATOs to be set up in the Middle East to confront Iran, and all that kind of thing. Things we've heard from him many, many times before, but things which visibly are not working. We're now in July 2024. There's been fighting in Gaza ever since October, and Hamas is still there. In fact, he talked about how Israel needs to maintain control, military control of Gaza, apparently indefinitely. So it seems war without end in Gaza and confrontation without end with Iran, and talk about setting up a NATO-type system in the Middle East. With whom precisely? With the Egyptians? With the Jordanians? With the Saudis? Well, that might have been a viable option a few years ago, but with the crisis, the ongoing crisis in Gaza, it's very, very difficult to see, all but impossible to see, how it could possibly be made to work. So there we go. It was exactly the same as what we have heard from Netanyahu before. Skillfully delivered, deeply manipulative, refusing any compromise, refusing any thought, denying any thought of compromise. Ideas, by the way, that Prime Minister Netanyahu might be open to some sort of ceasefire arrangement in Gaza. Well, as far as I could see, that is as far from his mind as ever. On the contrary, it's move forward ever deeper into the hole or the cul-de-sac into which he has been leading Israel, certainly since the 7th of October, but arguably for many, many more years beyond that. So, in some respects, another disturbing speech, and of course one which was applauded by most of the people in Congress, no fewer than 58 times. The lack of thinking, the absence of policy, the absence of ideas didn't seem to concern anybody there. They didn't seem to notice that the political ground in the Middle East is shifting, that Saudi Arabia and Iran are now both members of the BRICS, that the Saudis are talking with the other BRICS member states about setting up new financial and trading arrangements, that Iran is about to receive weapons supplies from the Russians, that Saudi Arabia has just sent a massive delegation to China, where apparently they've been discussing arms supplies by China, that Egypt is becoming restless and unhappy, the Jordan too. None of that seemed to impinge on any of these discussions that took place in Congress. It didn't seem to affect any of the support for Netanyahu in Congress, and it doesn't seem to be a reality that he recognizes, Netanyahu himself recognizes and is prepared to work with. So, two very unhappy speeches, one by Biden, as I said, the United States surrounded by enemies and enemies also now within. A very different tune, by the way, from the triumphalist one, the neocons used to sing back in the 1990s and the early 2000s. They haven't changed their approach and they haven't changed their policies. But where before they were full of boundless optimism and self-confidence, now they see everything in paranoid and apocalyptic terms. And as I said, the president himself mirrors that kind of language. And as for Prime Minister Netanyahu, well, he also wants to continue the same policies as he always has, just to do the same things all over again, only even more. Those policies have led Israel into crisis, but he seems completely unwilling to change them. We are stuck. Both the United States and Israel are stuck, and the rest of the collective West is stuck with them. Anyway, so much for those two speeches. The rest of the world continues to change and make its decisions and policies. There was a big plenum of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee. They discussed economic policy there. The Financial Times was very critical. It passed a very critical editorial saying that the Communist Party of China still seems to be committed to an investment-led model for China's development, that what China needs to do is to open up its markets, allow more Western goods to pour in, increase real incomes so that Chinese consumers can start buying all of these Western things. All the things, by the way, that Japan was advised to do in the 1980s, which didn't turn out well for Japan. Anyway, the Financial Times is very annoyed and unhappy that the Communist Party of China doesn't want to do them in China. I'm not going to get into the details of this. I'm not as much of an expert about the state of the Chinese economy. My sense is that it's gone through some rocky waters in the last few years, but it's managed to leave most of its problems behind, and that manufacturing growth is now accelerating and Chinese surpluses are again growing. And a fact which is now causing a certain amount of dismay. China is using the vast receipts that it's getting from its tremendous export growth to stockpile commodities, food, oil, precious metals, all of those things. And of course, it's just forged an unbreakable strategic partnership with the country, Russia, which is most able to supply China with still more of those things. And there are concerns being expressed now in the United States and elsewhere about the fact that the Chinese are doing this. And there are worries that this suggests that China is preparing for some kind of conflict with the United States, either military or economic, to which, of course, I can only reply, of course it is. And if you listen to the kind of things that have been said about China in the West, if you listen to what President Biden himself says about China, even in his latest address, he talked about China. He bragged about the fact that people don't talk so much anymore about China overtaking the United States as they did when he became president, as if that was really his major concern, which I suspect it probably is. Anyway, given this marked hostility that exists in the West today against China, and given the wild talk, which isn't just wild, it's widespread talk, that there has been in the United States about a military clash with China over Taiwan, well, of course the Chinese, who are far-seeing people, are doing what they can to prepare for that possibility. After all, I've been reading about US military plans to impose naval blockades of China, to deny China access to raw materials and commodities and other things that it needs to keep its economy functioning. I've been reading about these plans ever since the last years of President Obama's presidency. So, I mean, I don't find it at all surprising that the Chinese are thinking forward and thinking ahead. But going back to their third plenum, it is understandable why the latest Central Committee plenum, it is understandable why they would be doing all of these things, but they were also discussing further measures to develop the Chinese economy, which I think they will successfully do. Just saying, I think that people who predict and expect that there's going to be some kind of Chinese economic explosion, something that people like Gordon Chang have been predicting ever since the late 1990s, I think all of those people are going to be confounded all over again. Chinese economic growth will continue, not perhaps at 10% a year, as was the case a few years ago, but still at a very healthy clip, and is probably sustainable as well. Anyway, that is my own view. So things do continue around the world, but in Washington, in Jerusalem, in London, in Paris, where the political crisis, by the way, has just deepened, President Macron has just rejected the left's proposed candidate for the office of Prime Minister, a highly regarded and heavily overqualified French civil servant, of whom I know absolutely nothing, by the way, a Mrs. Castis, I believe, is her name. Anyway, he's rejected her outright. He says that the left does not have a majority in the parliament and cannot therefore form a government, which may very well be true, but they are still the biggest bloc, so it would be logical to at least give them the opportunity to try. But anyway, that is what Macron has done. He's rejected their proposed prime minister. The left is furious about this. They are saying that Macron appears to want to impose on them his own prime minister from his own party, and is trying to force them into some sort of a coalition arrangement against Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, even though they say that that is absolutely not something that they're ever going to agree to. Well, we will see. But anyway, political crisis in France, a state of stasis in Paris, nobody there, at least Macron himself, unable to think and come forward with anything new. So there it is. That's the situation that we face in the West. A total paralysis of decision-making. In the United States, complete uncertainty, or so it seems to me, about who now is truly in charge of the government. I noticed that in his address, President Biden stopped short of saying that he endorsed Kamala Harris and supported her candidacy as President of the United States in the election in November. I got the impression that he remains still very angry and embittered at the fact that he's not being allowed to stand himself. But anyway, presumably Kamala Harris will be the candidate, but she's going to have to contend with the fact that Biden is still president and her own ideas are still being formed and still being developed. And it's unlikely we're going to see any change at all in Western policy for the next couple of months, certainly not before the election in November, and perhaps not even beyond. Now, let me reiterate again that despite many who say that really this isn't the time to change things, I think that the time to adapt to changing circumstances is becoming increasingly urgent. That's the first thing. And the second is that options to change things absolutely do exist. Now, I'm going to give an example. Ray McGovern, one of the former top analysts at the CIA, a man who used to prepare the president's brief, the man who back in the 60s advised the US that, to general disbelief, that the Sino-Soviet split was for real. The same man who, again, to general disbelief, just a few years ago, was advising the United States that the Chinese-Russian rapprochement is for real. This person, who is, by the way, declaring an interest, someone I regard as a friend. Anyway, he's now come forward and has suggested that, in fact, if the administration, if President Biden, or indeed Kamala Harris, or whoever is in charge in the United States now, Jake Sullivan maybe, if they really wanted to change the direction of policy in the Middle East, this is a good moment, in fact, to do so, because it's quite clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli army are in conflict with each other. The army is as dismayed by Netanyahu's aggressive and belligerent policies. They are strongly opposed to Prime Minister Netanyahu's insistence that they conduct some sort of military offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon. They've already had a bad and unhappy experience in their war in Gaza, and they don't want to have an even worse war on their hands against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And as Ray McGovern correctly says, if the President of the United States were to make absolutely clear at this time that the United States would not support an Israeli operation in Lebanon, that might tilt the balance of the internal argument in Israel decisively in favor of the Israeli army. Of course, no one in the United States, no one in the administration is going to do anything like that. That kind of intelligent development of policy is not something you see any sign of today. Anyway, let's move on and talk about that other conflict, the conflict in Ukraine, which continues to develop and which President Biden, by the way, indicated it would remain his main priority, so far as I could see, over the next couple of months. Now, in my program yesterday, I gave an overview of the whole military situation along the contact line. I said that the situation of the Ukrainian military is becoming disastrous. I said that General Syrsky, the Ukrainian military commander, clearly has given up any real hope of victory. This became very clear over the course of an interview that he gave in The Guardian, in which he listed the size of the Russian forces in Ukraine, doing so in a way that showed that he clearly believes that Ukraine lacks the means to basically repel the Russian avalanche that is heading in Ukraine's direction. This despite the fact that he provided all kinds of the usual boilerplate assertions that victory is certain and all of the rest, which, as Ukraine's military commander, he has no option but to do. One point I omitted to mention in my program yesterday is what Syrsky also had to say about the F-16s. He basically admitted that they were not going to make any difference. He spoke about the Russian Air Force as very powerful, very well organized, very well equipped. He said if the F-16s came into conflict with the Russian Air Force, they would be quickly shot down. For that reason, they're going to be held back and won't go anywhere close, or at least no closer than 40 kilometers to the line of combat. Because they would be at, or not even the line of combat, Russian-controlled airspace, because they would be very quickly shot down if they did, which begs the question of what he actually thinks that they're going to do. Obviously not simply lie idle on the airfield at Starokonstantinov, where the Russians will destroy them. Presumably he hopes that he can use the F-16s to shoot down Russian subsonic cruise missiles and drones, but the Russians inevitably are going to go hunting for the F-16s. Their air force, their aircraft have much more powerful missiles and far more powerful radars, and far from the F-16s being the hunters, Syrsky effectively admitted that as soon as they arrive, they're going to be the hunted. So anyway, putting aside his various attempts to spin the disastrous picture for The Guardian, one can see why people like Marina Bezuglaya, the Ukrainian MP, think that privately Syrsky has given up. Well, the last couple of hours, 24 hours, have provided further news about how bad the situation for Ukraine is and have given further insight into the disastrous mood in Ukraine itself. Now, let me begin with a whole series of messages published by the 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian Army. As I said, doughty fighters that they are, they're nonetheless becoming increasingly pessimistic about the conduct of the war and increasingly critical of the decisions that are being made by the military leadership, the political and military leadership in Kiev. Yesterday, they published a whole series of statements on their Telegram channel about the situation in the area of the battlefront for which they're responsible for. This is Konstantinovka, the village of Konstantinovka, south of Kurachovo and Marinka, and the stretch of road leading from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar. They said that the Russians are undertaking an offensive on a wide front along the entire road, and that they've crossed the road in many places and that their reconnaissance groups are operating well to the west of the road. That's basically what they said. They said that they are desperately short of men and machines, and that all the best troops who ought to have been sent to reinforce them and other critical parts of the front have been sent instead to Kharkiv region to try to push back the Russians in an offensive there, which will have only cosmetic importance. Everywhere else, things are going from bad to worse. They also said that they had been the target of a colossal artillery, missile and bomb strike attack in Konstantinovka over the previous few hours. They spoke about panic amongst some of their troops. They said that they'd lost control of some of the outskirts of Konstantinovka, and they said that they'd suffered dozens of dead and wounded. So a pessimistic picture from the 79th Brigade. And, well, they gave us this report of this enormous Russian artillery, rocket and airstrikes on Konstantinovka. And a few hours later, a film began to appear, a video film, obviously made by drone operators of the 79th Brigade, but it seems hurriedly edited in Kiev. And these pictures showed a large-scale armoured assault by the Russians on a place somewhere in the region of Kurachovo. And of course, it's not difficult to work out that it is in fact Konstantinovka, and that this is an armoured assault, an assault by the Russians, moving a large force of tanks and armoured vehicles and troops towards Konstantinovka with the intention of storming this village, or at least beginning the operation to capture this village. And, well, we're told that 45 armoured vehicles, 12 motorcycles, these are assault troops, driving fast towards the Ukrainian lines on motorcycles, and around 200 men of the Russian army participated in this attack. And there's been any number of reproductions of this film, including, by the way, this morning in the Daily Mail. And the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians suffered catastrophic losses, that dozens of their tanks and armoured vehicles were damaged or destroyed, and that the Russians presumably were repelled, though that, in fact, is not the information that they are explicitly giving. Now, we've been here many times. The Ukrainians have done this before. They did this, as I remember, in the early stages of the Avdiivka battles, giving us all kinds of film about movements of Russian armoured columns towards Ukrainian positions in the Avdiivka sector, and of the Ukrainians conducting counterstrikes against these armoured columns. And on the basis of all that information, all sorts of excited reports appeared, especially in the Western media, about huge Russian material and human losses in the Avdiivka sector. And they did the same a couple of weeks ago, I can remember, in the area of the Izherebets and Oskol River, in connection with a supposed Russian armoured assault towards the village of Terny. And now they've done it again with this film of this Russian armoured assault towards the village of Konstantinovka. And always and invariably people jump to the conclusion that these reports, these Ukrainian claims about these massive Russian equipment and personnel losses, allegedly up to 40 Russian soldiers out of the 200 were killed or wounded in this assault. Anyway, supposedly this proves that the Russian assault has miscarried. Except if we go back to the earlier reports, the ones about Avdiivka was eventually captured. In the terms of the Terny assault, well, Terny is still in Ukrainian hands, but virtually all the other important villages in the Oskol and Zherebets river areas have either fallen to the Russians or are likely to do so before long, including Terny itself. And in terms of this latest assault on Konstantinovka, my sense, actually, looking at this film, which, as I said, has clearly been heavily edited, is that, in fact, the equipment losses are being overstated, that most of this armoured force reached its destination, which is presumably Konstantinovka, and the 79th Brigade yesterday was in effect admitting that the Russian troops have broken into the village, which would all imply that the assault has been, in most respects, a success. Just saying. Anyway, that is my own view. What exactly is going on in Konstantinovka, it's very difficult to say. We will probably get more information over the next couple of hours, but the clear trajectory of events in the Konstantinovka area, as was the case in the Avdiivka area, as is the case at the Zherebets and Oskol river areas, is that the Russians hold the initiative, are advancing, are proving unstoppable, are capturing more and more positions, and if they haven't yet broken into Konstantinovka, the apocalyptic tone of the 79th Brigade in describing the situation all but confirms that they will soon do so, and that Konstantinovka itself will shortly fall. So that's the situation in southern Donbas at the moment. This is a critical battle. Konstantinovka is an important village, even if the Russians have already cut the road in other places. If Konstantinovka falls, the Russians will be able to move closer to Kurakovo. They're already, of course, advancing towards Kurakovo through the other village of Maximilianovka, which they are also in the process of storming. But if Konstantinovka falls, the net around Vugleda is going to tighten very considerably, and the Ukrainians will be facing an even more severe operational crisis than the one in this region that they already are. Just saying. So anyway, that is the news, as I said, in this part of the battlefields. A crisis for the Ukrainians. The situation has sharply deteriorated for them in the last 24 hours since I did my previous program. And the same is now true increasingly in the Ocheretino-Pokrovsk area. The Russians appear, according to most reports, to have captured another important village, which is the village of Vocha. The Ukrainian troops in between Lozovatska and Progress remain trapped. The Russians are said to be pushing further westwards. There's reports that they're now moving south from Vocha towards another village called Zelanye. This is another one of these villages that the Russians seem to be working towards capturing. And the Russians also are apparently sending reconnaissance troops, probing towards another village called Ivanivka, which places them even closer, ever closer, to Mirnograd and to Pokrovsk itself. And a couple of days ago, there were reports that the Russians were attacking a village called Timofeevka, And as I've discussed, they're outside the village of Vozhozhenka, which, when they do storm it, that will push them astride the road between Mirnograd and Pokrovsk in the west, and the important the other places that the Ukrainians are seeking to defend, places like Chasiv Yar and the town of Konstantinovka, and of course Torets region further to the east. Now, there have been, as I've said, over the last couple of hours, increasing admissions, including a long article about this in the Kiev Independent, which finally acknowledges the disastrous situation that the Ukrainians are facing in Pokrovsk. Now, with some difficulty, because the picture I have of his message is very unclear, I'm going to read what I can read of a message which has been posted by the Ukrainian reporter Yuri Butusev about the situation in the Pokrovsk area, which is clearly becoming very critical. And he says that the situation in the Pokrovsky area is critically difficult, which immediately requires systematic and balanced decisions by the headquarters of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Over the past 7 days, the enemy advanced 6 kilometers in the direction of Mirnograd-Pokrovsk. On a narrow front, the flanks were shot through, but advanced. The city of Mirnograd is 14 kilometers away, 14 kilometers from the Russians. A total of 14 kilometers. Mirnograd is in the zone of long-range artillery fire. If the Russians are allowed to enter Mirnograd, they get a zone of concentration and accumulation, and will be able to attack Pokrovsk itself. The Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration is the last area of defense before Dnipropetrovsk region. In other words, before the Russians reach the Dnieper itself, near to the great industrial city of Dnipropetrovsk. Dnipro. The enemy is very close. The situation is critical, as the pace of the enemy's advance is alarming. And Butusev, who, as I said, is a Ukrainian reporter, very capable, very talented Ukrainian reporter, he complains about how bad the situation altogether is. He complains about incompetent leadership, major mistakes, a lack of coordination by the Ukrainian commanders. And what he says about the critical situation in the Pokrovsk area is mirrored by Julian Repke, the correspondent for the German newspaper Bild Zeitung. The Ukrainian army lost 6 villages and more than 40 square kilometers over the past week. This is again in the Pokrovsk area. Does anybody have any idea how Russia will slow down this pace of losing the country towards the Russians? And I don't think anybody actually does, because for the moment at least, the Russian advance looks unstoppable. It's clear that the Russians have more of everything in this area, and the Ukrainians without defenses are finding it impossible to hold the Russians back. The Russians have many more tanks, many more armored vehicles, they have far more powerful artillery, they have complete control of the skies. We've seen that the F-16, Syrsky admits the F-16s aren't going to make any difference. And there are also reports that the Russians are now dominant in drones, in drone warfare. And here I owe debt to Simplicus the Thinker, because he's now provided us with a very interesting series of comments by the Ukrainian official who is in overall charge of the situation with drones. And this is one of the most interesting discussions I've seen up to now, because we are repeatedly told that Ukraine is not only ahead of the Russians in drone warfare, but that all Ukraine has to do is hold out for a year, and in a year's time, fleets of AI drones will be supplied to Ukraine from the West, and that this is going to change the whole situation on the battlefronts. Anyway, the Ukrainian official who is in charge of drones is a gentleman called Colonel Vadim Sukharevsky, and he's provided an account of the situation in terms of drone warfare in Ukraine to The Economist. This is the same Economist which a few days ago was telling us that the Russians are about to run out of tanks and armoured vehicles and can only produce 100 barrels for their guns every year. I've already explained why all of that is absolute nonsense. Anyway, Sukharevsky, who, as I said, is Ukraine's leading official in terms of drones, he debunks all of this, just as Syrsky is telling us the real situation about the actual military balance in Ukraine. So Sukharevsky, who does, by the way, come across as an extremely capable figure in terms of understanding drone warfare, probably one of the leading figures in drone warfare today. Anyway, he tells us that the situation today for Ukraine is becoming increasingly critical in terms of drone warfare. First of all, he says that the Russians massively outnumber the Ukrainians in drones. And we have this section from the article. This is the article in The Economist. Russia's full-scale invasion marked a step change in drone warfare. Initially, it was Ukraine that got ahead, developing an army of cheap, small drones to counter Russia's overwhelming artillery and missile advantage. That has since changed. Now, enemy drones outnumber Ukrainian drones 6-1. The article then goes on to say that Ukrainians still have superior tactics and innovation, and Ukraine tends to be first in developing and adapting new technologies, but Russia has advantage in mass production, means it can adapt and scale up faster. The pace of change is frenetic, with feedback loops, meaning that some software is updated every few hours. By the time Russian drones reach the front lines, Ukraine has sometimes already developed countermeasures. And then he goes on to say, this is from Sukharevsky, quantitatively, Russia is ahead, but qualitatively, we are keeping them at parity. So it looks as if one understands, if he takes that sentence at face value, the Ukrainians are able to match the Russians qualitatively, and even sometimes keep a foot ahead of them, but that the Russians, to the extent that they are behind in application of drones, and that's far from clear, the Russians ultimately have mass on their side. They have 6 drones for every drone that Ukraine has. And Sukharevsky then goes on to say, military operations still depend on combined arms, and other kinds of troops will continue to be just as important. Drones serve as a complement to traditional forces, offering better reconnaissance and more precise capability at a reduced risk to soldiers. But Sukharevsky basically ridicules the whole notion that drones replace artillery All of these things are necessary. Ukraine can inflict more casualties on Russia, but it cannot replace with drones. But it cannot substitute. Drones cannot substitute or replace artillery, which is a point that I've been making all the time. But then he goes on to say, and this is perhaps the most interesting part, that the armies of the fleets of killer drone swarms operating independent of human control are a myth. And this is again from The Economist. Ukraine already employs AI to optimize functionality. For example, if the link between drone and pilot is lost, but the use is specialized and limited. As a commander, I will never relinquish the bulk of decision-making to artificial intelligence. In the distant future, we need such a decision. We look at it carefully, but you don't need AI to create swarms. So, the whole idea, fleets of drones operating on AI, robotically defeating the Russians, is a fantasy. The man who's in charge of Ukraine's drones, Colonel Sukharevsky, is now the person who's telling us as much. And in the meantime, and in reality, it is the Russians who, in terms of drones, hold the quantitative advantage. The gap in capability between Russia and Ukraine in terms of drones, to the extent that it exists, is small. And of course, as we're always reminded, in war, quantity anyway has a quality all of its own. So there we are. The Russians have more of everything, and they're pushing forward relentlessly in Pokrovsk, in the Pokrovsk area. According to Butusev, they're now 14 kilometers from Mirnograd. If they capture Mirnograd, Pokrovsk becomes not just vulnerable, but basically undefendable. If Pokrovsk falls, the Russians are able to reach the Dnieper and challenge the Ukrainians in Dnipropetrovsk region and ultimately reach the Dnieper opposite the city of Dnipro itself. So an absolutely critical situation for the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are acknowledging the fact. And of course, in other places along the battlefronts, the situation is every bit as bad. Reports were appearing yesterday of further Russian advances in the Toretsk and in the Toretsk area. Russian forces appear to be gradually, the two pincer movements that are gathering around Toretsk appear to be closing. There were reports a couple of days ago that there's at least 2 battalions of Ukrainian troops potentially trapped inside these 2 closing pincers. We saw, I discussed yesterday and the day before, how it seems that there are 2 companies, or at least, well, some say 2 battalions. I've now seen it suggested it's 2 companies, but several hundred Ukrainian troops trapped in the Pokrovsk or Cheretino area between the villages of Lozuvatske and Progress, and there's a very bitter discussion of all of this between the soldiers who have been trapped in this way and the DS mapping project. The soldiers clearly feeling that they've been abandoned by their command, who is telling them to stand and fight where they are. And just before I started doing this program, the military summary channel was reporting that Ukrainian troops in Krasnogorovka, apparently all of the remaining Ukrainian troops in Krasnogorovka are apparently trapped as well. That the Ukrainians have left it far too late to pull their troops out of Krasnogorovka. The Russians have now established fire control over all of the roads leading into Krasnogorovka, and that the Ukrainians are effectively trapped there. And just to finish, all of these updates to my summary, my military summary of yesterday, more reports of more Russian devastating missile strikes. The latest one, a missile strike using Iskander M missiles on a Ukrainian repair facility in the city of Kharkiv. The Russians have produced a very dramatic film of this. You see large numbers of Ukrainian armored vehicles concentrated in this facility where they were supposed to be repaired. You can see pictures of Bradleys and other machines there. And of course, the Russians, with their round-the-clock drone surveillance, identified this location, and the Iskander missile was launched with its cluster warhead, and one must assume that the great majority of those armoured vehicles were probably damaged beyond repair. So, that's the situation on the battle lines. Constant Russian advances right across the battlefronts, constant weakening of the Ukrainian army. I said yesterday that Syrsky predicts that the Ukrainian army will number somewhere in the region of 600 to 700,000 men by the end of this year, that this is where the Russians are heading. And we're getting reports, we continue to get reports, that the Ukrainians, despite the mobilization, are desperately short of men. And again, I'm going back to Simplicius the Thinker here. He's found an article, in fact a video, of a Estonian army official, a general, Riho Juhtegi, I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, but he said, this Estonian officer says that Ukrainian plans to form 10 new brigades turned out to be ineffective. Instead, mobilization is mainly aimed at closing gaps at the front. Today, many units claim to be fully staffed, but in fact face a shortage of personnel. Inadequate training and the static nature of trench warfare makes it costly and dangerous. And there is insufficient time to train new soldiers. Weekly training is not enough to effectively fight in the trenches. Insufficient training of new fighters creates risks at the front, which the Russian side is actually using. And Simplicius the Thinker found a whole thread with a Ukrainian officer called Maxim Skrinik, and he said that in this piece, Skrinik says that there are Ukrainian battalions which have no more than 20 to 30 men left in their ranks. A battalion would normally number 400 to 500 men, and in some companies, that's a force that would probably number around 100 men. There are no more than 5, and there's a lot of descriptions of the desperate shortages of men in many units. And former Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the former Deputy Chief of Ukraine's General Staff, Lieutenant General Romanenko, confirmed it as much. At the front, units are staffed by a third in certain areas. Difficult to say in such areas. It's not necessary to count on serious ones, so that there are offensive actions, but also on defensive ones. So, in fact, there is a huge shortage of men, not enough for defense, let alone for attack. And he says that the shortage of middle and junior officers in the Ukrainian army leads to an increase in losses, especially amongst the recently mobilized who have no experience in warfare. And the situation, in other words, is critical. Helmer in his recent piece in Dances with Bears, gives a further sense of Ukrainian losses. He starts in the first week of July a year ago, average daily number of Ukrainians killed or wounded in action was 716. In the corresponding period of this month, the level had jumped to an average of 1,948, an increase of almost threefold. In the same week of 2023, the destruction or damage of US-made M777 artillery pieces was 8. In the first week of this July, the M777 loss number was 17. And Helmer has written another fascinating article talking about how the Russians have come to the conclusion that the most effective way of destroying Ukrainian supplies is not to try to destroy the vehicle trains close to the border, the supply trains close to the border, but to wait until they get closer to the front lines, to track them, to keep them under observation along the way, and then to destroy them close to the contact line. And apparently the Russians have been doing that with increasing effectiveness. So overall, it is an absolutely terrible picture. Now, yesterday I spoke about how the Ukrainians appear to be acting with growing desperation. They've sent their foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, to Beijing, where he's trying to talk to the Chinese about starting some kind of negotiations process with the Russians. They've been speaking to the Vatican about the same thing. But of course, they continue to give contradictory signals, because even as the Ukrainians talk peace, they also continue to urge their allies in the West to authorize them to conduct deep strikes with missiles far within Russian territory. And they've given no sign that they are, for the moment, prepared to negotiate seriously on any one of Russia's core demands. They seem to hope that if they say that they're open for negotiations and agree to negotiations, that the Russians will be prevailed upon to agree to a ceasefire, which the Russians have made absolutely clear that they're not going to do. And in fact, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has just made these comments. He said, Russia is open for a negotiation process, but first we need to understand how prepared Ukraine is and whether it has permission for that from its handlers. In other words, from the Americans and the British. At this point, you can see that contradictory statements are being made and things are not clear. And Peskov pointed out that a ban on communications with Russia remained in effect in Ukraine, and a lot of things need to be clarified with regard to talks. So the Russians remain utterly skeptical about this process, and of course they've ruled out a ceasefire whilst the negotiations continue. So there it is. That remains the overall situation at the present time. We have a situation where Ukraine is losing the war. I think in Kiev, the penny has dropped, as we say in Britain. They understand finally that the way things are going, they are going to be defeated. They're desperately looking for a way out, but they're not prepared to make the concessions that they must make in order to get that way out. And in the West, there is complete paralysis. The leaders of the West remain intransigently incapable of changing their policy lines. One event, more than any other, demonstrates this fact to me. And this is the treatment, the continued treatment by the European powers of Hungary and Slovakia. Now, Prime Minister Orbán of Hungary tried to carry out a mediation mission between the Ukrainians, the Russians, and he also spoke to the Chinese, and he reported what was happening to the Americans, and he had a meeting with the man who might potentially be America's president in 6 months, who was Donald Trump. The Europeans have blocked Orbán's attempt to convene a foreign ministers' meeting where a proper report from the Hungarians can be provided. The Europeans are also refusing to take any action to support Hungary and Slovakia following Zelensky's petulant decision to block oil deliveries to Hungary and Slovakia along pipelines from Russia. Now, at this point in the war, these belligerent and aggressive steps seem trebly misguided. As I've said already, given the realities on the battlefronts, given the political realities in the United States, there is a real chance that at some point over the next few months, the Europeans might find themselves being left high and dry, as either the Americans and the Russians or the Russians and the Ukrainians start peace talks. At that point, it is essential for the Europeans to maintain open lines of communication, and therefore they need to do that through Orbán, who is the only person who hasn't yet closed them. And yet they are intent on punishing him. And the Ukrainians are intent on punishing him also by cutting off Hungary's and Slovakia's supply of oil. This despite the fact that Ukraine itself is going through a terrible electricity crisis and is supplementing its own electricity shortages with imports of electricity from the European Union, 60% of which come from Slovakia and Hungary. I mean, it makes so little sense. It is almost beyond belief. But that is where it is. Anger, emotion, stubbornness, arrogance, a denial of reality, all of them are working to prevent any change in policy. In the meantime, in Ukraine, the Russian steamroller, to conjure up a metaphor of former times, trundles remorselessly westwards, crushing everything in its wake. And trundles westwards towards Europe, which has no plan and which could soon find itself cut off from the United States, which is also experiencing a leadership vacuum and which appears to be in disarray. I've never known times like these. I hope we get out of them soon. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget also to check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.